Welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Donors and Data, Where Do We Draw the Line? This is a presentation co-hosted by RKD Group and the Nonprofit Alliance Foundation. I'm Shannon McCracken, CEO of the Nonprofit Alliance and the Nonprofit Alliance Foundation. We have a very big group registered for today, so we would like to ask for your help using some of the Zoom features. If we can jump ahead to the next slide, right there, you can see at the bottom of your screen, you have a toolbar. Many of you are already familiar with this. We've all been Zooming for many months now. We'd like to ask, though, that you use the Q&A specifically to raise up questions that you would like us to share with our panelists. So again, use the Q&A function to put in a question for the panelist. Use the chat for conversation that you would like to have with your fellow attendees. So if there is a question you want to kind of put out to the group about something you're hearing, if there's a data point that you agree with or disagree with, if you have an anecdote to share, the chat is a great place for that because everybody can see that communication. And then we can use the Q&A to just be able to filter and find those questions for our panelists today. So thank you for your help with that. We are joined by a great group. Catharine Holihan is Managing Director, Direct Mail and Marketing Operations with American Cancer Society. And Karen Woods is Territorial Director of Integrated Marketing with the Salvation Army Eastern Territory. Karen and Catharine are going to join us a little bit later in the program. But right now, Cathy Folks, Chief Data Officer from RKD Group, is going to step in with us. Our program is really two parts today. We're going to start with looking at some survey data. RKD Group and the Nonprofit Alliance Foundation co-commissioned an attitudinal study of consumers, of charitable donors last summer. And we asked a couple different sets of questions on a couple topics. And one of those was on attitudes towards data usage, personal data, data privacy. So Cathy is she's digested all of the data, put it into some easily readable graphs, and is going to step us through that for the first part of today. Then in the second part, again, Karen and Catharine will join us, and we'll get to talk about more of the practitioner point of view, how they're approaching this within their organizations. Cathy, the whole topic of data privacy certainly isn't new. I think since about the day after direct marketing was invented, we started talking about data privacy, responsibility, data security, who owns data within an organization, our responsibility to donors and donor intent. And yet the tension feels so much greater now than it did, in years past. And I think that's because data is booming. You and I were chatting earlier this week. You were sharing in Massachusetts that data that our cars collect is a hot topic there right now. Who has access to that? How can you use information about where people have been and their driving behavior? So that just the amount of data that is taken in, that is stored, that is used, that is meaningful, and is potentially personal and sensitive data is just such a huge topic. And nonprofits, like everyone else, are feeling that conflict and that tension, the usability, the value of data balanced against our responsibility for transparency and accountability to our donors. So before we jump into you sharing the data from last summer, I think it would be helpful for us to get just a data point from our audience today. So we're going to put up a quick poll here. Coming in a moment. Oh, I skipped. Okay. Well, we've got the poll going. I missed a point there, but that's all right. We'll go ahead and do our poll. We have 3 questions up right now, and we want to talk about or get a sense of the audience's approach to data, how you would say your own organization is approaching data privacy. This is anonymous, so be candid. Leave it open for 10 more seconds. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at those results. Okay, so just over half of our attendees said that donor privacy is at the forefront of data practices. Slightly fewer people are saying that they could be more transparent. They have good policies. Some of that's just taking policy and putting it into practice. And then there are a few who were honest enough or honest about saying their data privacy practices need a lot of help, that they're at the beginning of that and recognizing that challenge. So fantastic. Thanks for sharing those results. And let me go back and catch up on the point that I missed on the last slide, which is just sharing a snapshot of the state map and I think we have a little bit of lag time. There we go. Of the state map and what legislation is looking like. And as you can see from this patchwork quilt of state laws that unfortunately, since Congress has been horribly slow about coming up with one standard, comprehensive, practical approach to data across all states, that the states have needed to take that or have chosen to take that on themselves to try to regulate. And the different colors here represent the different stages that those states are in, either with completely passed laws or just introducing those and somewhere in between. And this map changes on a regular basis. It's still early in the calendar year. Many states have long legislative sessions still open, and we will continue to see this change. We are not going to spend a lot of time talking about the legislation specifically today, actually very little time. Later this month on February 23rd, the Nonprofit Alliance, DMAW, and DMFA are co-presenting a much deeper dive into current legislation. We'll share that webinar information at the end of today's program. But let's jump in, Cathy, if you can take over the reins and start sharing some of those survey findings.
Oops, yep, there we go. So we conducted the survey in August of last year. It included a little over 1,000 donors. There were donors who gave $100 or more in 2019. We split it between 50% men, 50% women, and then 25% millennials. We split Gen X into two groups because we find that they react a little bit differently. You know, we have different life stages if you're in your late 40s versus your mid or late 50s. And baby boomers. So we're going to talk about those cohorts of data as we walk through this. So finding number one, the strongest support for using data to streamline communication. So we found that people were very positive about using data to ensure we communicate with them in a way that means we know something about them, right? We know we've sent them an email already, or we've talked to them about a specific issue. Absolutely, for the most part, happy with using that information to make sure we don't repeat ourselves or don't overshare. Very small percentage of our survey results were opposed to us using the data to communicate with them better. So this finding, I don't think is surprising, but I think it's something we need to continue to remember, right? Is if we have this information, use it. If we know we've talked to them about it, change the message, etc. So, you know, okay to use what we have from what this survey says, but make sure you continue to use it if you have it. We can go to the next. So number two, strongest opposition to selling and bartering data. There's a specific reason we use the language in this particular question, and it's because this is the way the legislature talks to this issue. It would not be the way we talk to our donors about it, obviously, but understand as you work through this, that this is what, so 50%, 56% were totally against bartering or selling. And I think we need to clearly understand those words, bartering and selling. It's not what we would tell our donors. What we tell our donors is, you know, by trading names or buying other names, we're reducing the cost of fundraising and putting more money towards our mission. So I think there's an important conversation to have with legislators about this issue, but also understand how we talk about how we rent or exchange names, and understanding their understanding of that portion, that if we use that language, which is legislature language, it's they're totally against it, and the word totally is fairly strong, I think. So go to finding three. This survey response was a little surprising. So larger donors more comfortable with the use of data. You know, big donors are a little bit more comfortable with using the data to talk to them. Some of this may be, and our panelists will talk about this a little later, because they already have a relationship with you if they're a larger donor and they feel like you already know a certain amount. But interesting. The other thing is we looked at auto-filling donation forms as opposed to just using the data to personalize their experience, and saw a little bit different, that small donors do not like the autofill for a large amount. I guess they're the feeling of a little bit of big brother in putting in their information. So just interesting to see, especially around the large donors, being okay with using data to communicate with them, and it's a little bit different for the smaller medium donors across the board. So finding number 4, younger donors more comfortable with the use of data. This one I think is not surprising when we look at age range. So donor sentiment using forms to autofill, the younger generation is perfectly fine with that. Much more acceptable because they do it all the time, every day. And then the other interesting item is that the younger donors were much more open to bartering and selling data. We think some of this may actually be because they don't really understand what that means and haven't been in the mail stream enough to know that their name may be being exchanged. But also just a very interesting finding that baby boomer sentiment is totally against using their name for buying and selling, and it gets a little bit better. I reversed that comment. I apologize. Okay, and finding 5. So finding 5 was also very surprising. A high concern about data breaches, but not so much about nonprofits. We all handle a lot of information for our donors, in some cases, including credit card information, name, address, phone number, email, certainly. But the donors don't feel that it's as important an issue with the nonprofit as it might be in a general commercial area. 48% very concerned about data breaches in general, high number. But only 36 concerned about data breaches at nonprofits. So I think, we need to be very careful and purposeful and manage our donors' data and convince them that it's safe. We all know there've been some data breaches of recent record. And sometimes donor data does get exposed in places that it shouldn't be. So again, we need to make sure that we're cognizant of the fact that they're not as concerned about it, but we need to be as concerned about it as good stewards of their data. So I think in this particular instance, it's the weight should be on us as good stewards of their data and understand that it is possible that other data could be accessed outside of the system. So, yep.
We're whipping through the slides there. So we did want to turn off the slideshow there, the deck, and bring in Catherine and Karen. And Cathy, thank you for running us through that. Sometimes data is a lot to take in, and you zipped us through pretty quickly. So we can flash back to some of those if we want some clarification. But really, we wanted to spend some of this time again with Karen and Catherine and talk about how you're living this, right? So it's Cathy can look at it across the whole landscape and provide guidance and provide insight and interpretation. It's the two of you and your teams on the front lines talking to donors on a regular basis. So before we jump in, if I can invite both of you to, each of you to introduce yourselves and then just give us some perspective on how what we're talking about here today relates to your daily lives, how you're approaching the data responsibility. And Karen, maybe we can start with you.
Thanks for having me. Great presentation start and the findings. My name is Karen Woods. I'm the Territorial Director for Salvation Army in the Eastern Territory. And so I oversee caging, direct marketing, the digital team, the database, and so forth. So in doing that, I also work as a liaison with external vendors and the internal team, namely IT and legal, as it pertains to data privacy. So we have been doing a lot of work because in March of 2020, the New York Shield Act was effective. So what we had to do was show that we had, at least by that time, had made an effort to adhere to that particular law. So that meant looking at all contracts for all vendors who had access to our data. And we had to take a look at what they're doing with it. There's a whole slew of questions that pertains to the use, where they keep it, how they keep it, and so who has access and so forth. So it's been a really interesting educational journey for us, and any new contracts, we've had to do the same. So, that's, as we walk through this, I encourage everybody to, if you haven't already, start those conversations because they're going to be really important for you and your organization.
Good call out, Karen. Thank you. And it's so your role is I sort of queued it up really as your relationship with donors, but as you've pointed out, it's also the all the other internal players, and it's your vendors and partners, everybody who's touching it's the whole ecosystem of data. So thank you for outlining that. And Catherine, American Cancer Society.
Hey guys, it's great to see you. Thanks for having me. And I've been with the American Cancer Society for about 10 years, and I lead a team that includes direct mail, a few other items like the CARS donation program, acknowledgements, and some other operational things. And, anytime we get feedback from a donor, because we're marketing at such a large scale, like that feedback is really, really valuable. And so, we really always strive to be relevant in our communications, especially as, where it comes to driving, revenue. But, I love how, Karen teed it up as well. Like you think about like all of those other back end processes and things that, the data gets handled, and the data doesn't live in an island, right? And so, it's definitely a responsibility that we've taken very seriously at the American Cancer Society. And we do have a lot of resources from our legal team to our privacy team, and have really done a lot to prepare for some of the emerging legislation. But GDPR was really kind of the big thing that kind of teed off preparing for that, and making sure that even though we are the American Cancer Society, like just the fact that it's in the news and something that people talk about, like we hear about it. So, someone would call up and say, hey, I heard about the GDPR. I'd like you to delete my data. Like we needed to be able to respond to those kinds of requests, really from a place of earning donor trust and being able to kind of connect with them where they are and honor their needs and wishes.
Excellent. And I know American Cancer Society was really one of the leading organizations in terms of the level and thoroughness of your response to GDPR compliance. And not all organizations in the US felt like they needed to comply with the EU regulation or looked at the cost of that, versus the number of donors or site visitors that they were getting from the EU, and didn't necessarily do as much as ACS did. Do you think, I'm sort of tilting the question in your direction here, right? But my question was going to be, do you think that GDPR preparation that you did makes you now more nimble for the state patchwork quilt that I was just showing? Or does your organization kind of look at this like every state, every new law is another kind of starting over from scratch?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So energetically, there is kind of this question of like, do we have to comply or not comply, right? And there's a whole layer of process support and kind of thinking things through from that angle. And then, we also approached it too from the donor's point of view. So if someone calls up, and says, hey, I want to go paperless, right? Because that's something that kind of comes up. Or, if there's a lot in the headlines of the news around a big data breach, every now and then, if we send out a package through our acquisition program, someone will call us and say, hey, has my identity been stolen? And so, like really thinking through, like, how do we kind of address that need? Because they're raising their hand, they're coming to us. So if someone who lives in Wisconsin calls out GDPR and says, I want you to delete me, we don't have to comply with that. But like ultimately, we have some questions that we kind of probe them a little bit more, like, are you getting too many mailings from us? Like, what prompted this, so that we can apply the appropriate suppression to their record and really kind of give them that same end result of what they were ultimately asking for.
Excellent. Yeah. And Cathy and Karen, I see both of you nodding. Anything you want to add to that balance between compliance and stewardship?
Yeah, I think, if a donor doesn't want to be on your list, you should certainly take them off, right? There's no reason to keep them if they don't want to be there. I think the harder part is sometimes knowing every place that you're managing them. And that's where that piece gets hard. We all use third parties and we have multiple databases, and the average nonprofit has eight databases. So if you just look at that number, so I think preparing for that is a little bit trickier.
Let's go back. You've mentioned data breaches. That's where, Cathy, where you left off with sharing some of the survey data. Let's spend a little more time talking about data breaches. And we certainly see this in legislation where there's this blurring of the lines sometimes, or maybe not so much legislation, but kind of the public conversation, what we're talking about in media, this blurring of the lines with data privacy. Sometimes that term is used to refer to the authorized use of data. So once we collect a donor's information, how are we using or protecting that data, sharing it with others, coming back to some of those verbs, Cathy, that you pulled out, versus a data breach, which is unauthorized access. So with the, obviously all of us are against data breaches, but they unfortunately do happen. What are some of the steps your organizations are taking, or how are you defining ownership of responsibility for this within your organizations? What, Karen and Catherine, either one of you want to jump in on that question?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, we actually got together with IT and our legal department, and so we outlined a process and some protocols, and some of the specific questions that we ask the vendors to answer via what we call a PIPA, our Personal Information Processing Agreement. So we ask them to let us know how is the data going to be shared, is making sure there's a secured protocol, what kind of data is shared, who has access to it, this whole slew of questions that we feel like it's our responsibility to understand that so that we can be in the forefront. And then there's an agreement with whoever we're sharing the data with, that they are going to live up to a certain level of responsibility, so that as stewards of our donors' data, we feel like we're protecting them as well.
Yeah, and just to, add to it, the points that Karen was making, we've followed a similar process, right? Where, our legal team and our privacy team and IT, there really is like a great spirit of collaboration and very much a desire to kind of come at things from the perspective of not just how we meet donor needs, but how do we minimize risk, right? And so, early on, of course, there was a very systematic effort to really catalog all of the places where data exists and how it's utilized and who the point people are, and then who's the backup person, and what are the very specific processes that we need to follow, if there is a deletion request, for example, and have all of that queued up, documented, ready to go. And then as any new vendor partners or relationships come on, they also follow a series of questions where we get all that information so that we have clear line of sight and understanding before any information is shared. And it's a two-way street. Like, there are times too when our vendors, have some processes and things too that, they would like us to be kind of thorough and complete about too. And, it kind of really ties back to this notion of risk and making sure that we're, following the legislation and compliance, components of what we need to do, but then also too, understanding what the timelines are, so that when we're having a conversation with a donor, depending on how they connect back to, or donor or constituent, how they connect back to all of those other, places that data lives, so that they know what to expect.
And both of you coming from very large organizations. So as you're talking about departments, you're talking about many people, differently resourced than many organizations. And it sounds also like in both cases, development and marketing is part of that conversation, versus sometimes those decisions are made entirely by IT or entirely by legal, and you're on the receiving end of that, or kind of coming late to the conversation. Cathy, do you see among your RKD clients and perhaps smaller organizations where the experience looks different, and how do you help advise that?
Yeah, and that's a great question. It is, and sometimes legal doesn't understand why, the direct marketing team needs to use the data the way it uses it, and that it's perfectly acceptable. So sometimes there can be this tension in between either IT or legal in terms of who owns the process. I think if we keep in mind that it's all about the donor, right, that it helps that conversation. And, I think what sometimes IT and legal forget is that our donors want the marketing information. I don't know about you guys, but this year I've had more follow-up on people that didn't get mail than I've ever seen before, which, so it's not like they think sometimes that it's this annoyance. It's one, it's keeping us all in business, and two, but I think it can be harder with a smaller organization. And again, with the smaller organizations, really knowing where all your data is sometimes a little bit more of a challenge. But there's some easy ways to follow up on all of that.
So let's shift the conversation a little bit. Let's get back to the point, Cathy, that you called out on some of the terminology that's used commonly by consumer advocates, by media, by legislators. So selling data, bartering data, very profit-oriented terms. That's why we see some proposed legislation out there that says individuals should be compensated for their data. If somebody's making money off my personal information, I should get a check at the end of the year, and those kinds of conversations that happen. So nonprofits approach data. We're nonprofits, right? We're not out there for the sake of making money. We're out there to be looking for cures and helping people and all the nonprofit causes. So we talk about data differently. And Cathy, maybe I'm kind of queuing you up to put some of those phrases out there, the way we talk about it. And then Karen, I'll maybe put you on the seat first here about when a donor comes to you and asks for clarification on how their data is being shared, or what permissions are or aren't in place, how you frame that up. But Cathy, anything you want to add to that before we open it to Karen?
Yeah, I think so. Some of the better language around this is sort of donor choice, right? And it doesn't need to be an opt-in, but it's a way to get out. So making sure. So the conversation needs to be, again, there's a reason we use this data, right? It helps our mission and it helps us make more money. But I think if we couch it as a donor choice, which is what some of the commercial organizations are moving to, where they have to, follow GDPR and some other things. I think it makes it a little bit easier. We also have to make it easier, I think, in some cases for our donors to opt in and opt out. And technically, sometimes the solutions are tougher. But I think that helps the conversation along. And Karen and Catherine, and what you think about sort of that process.
Yeah, it is interesting. Well, Salvation Army doesn't rent or exchange, but we still have the same issue because we do participate in co-ops, and people oftentimes don't really understand what a co-op is. So we encounter the same sort of situation. So it's a matter of educating people in your organization, because to Cathy's point, this is why that's our mission. In order to achieve our mission, we do need these donations. So there's always this delicate balance of what do you share, how do you share it, and honoring the donor's intent. And I think everybody said something that's really valuable is that when the donors call, it's actually an opportunity to talk to them, to find out what it is they really want. And it's interesting, Cathy, that you said it's the first time that you've ever had people calling about, we're not getting mail, because we're getting the same thing. And
I've never seen it like it is this year. It's very odd, but it's okay.
Yeah, they're like, well, I don't get mail from you guys anymore. Why? Please send me stuff. So it's been really interesting. And it is a delicate balance. Making sure that we steward the donors, as Catherine has said many times, making sure that we do include them on, like, we have preferences. So if they prefer to hear about one subject versus another, homelessness, feeding, human trafficking, whatever, we try to tailor to what they want to hear about. The challenge for us too is the technology sometimes is not as fast as the donors would like. We can take them off or flag them, but it takes a while to get through the system, and the average person doesn't really understand that. So sometimes we're hampered by the very technology we use. But that is the reality, and we just explain to the donor. Most of the time they're understanding, but that is something we encounter as well.
Yeah, and to add to what Karen said, I don't know if any of you guys have ever had the joy of reading your privacy policy on your website. I know it doesn't sound like the most thrilling document in the world, but that's a great way to kind of communicate in very practical language. what the practices of the organization are. And there's a way to like speak like a human being versus, you know, a lawyer, you know, and we've tried very carefully to
Not
do
that
that.
lawyers aren't human beings for any
They're lovely human
lawyers
beings,
attending.
for
Yeah.
sure. But, you know, at the same time, you know, like the burden isn't on the donor to read all of that stuff and understand it. So if somebody calls up, you know, and says, oh, I've heard about this and da, 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 da. We certainly have suppressions and things to deal with those scenarios that we can definitely create an experience that's relevant to them. And, you know, it's so funny kind of in getting ready for this call, like there have been so many times where I go to a party or, you know, over to visit a neighbor and they'll show up with like a stack of mail and they're like, you've been mailing me a lot, you've been busy. And it's like, I'll flip through it and like, some of it isn't even the American Cancer Society stuff. So, I mean, it's all happened to all of us, I'm sure, where you get calls to the call center and you go to look the person up in the CRM and they're not in there, right? So we have given our call center some talking points around DMA choice. And like, how great, like if you love getting catalogs for gardening stuff, you can still get that, but you can say no more solicitations, or I don't want, you have, and that's a great resource for donors and those who call in to inquire about what they're receiving so that they do have some creative control over what they're getting in their mailbox.
And you said two really important words in that, Catherine. It's choice and it's control. You know, ultimately, like Karen, when there's frustration with the technology and the time lag or perceived time lag, it's because you feel like as a consumer, as a donor, you feel like you didn't have control in that situation. I expressed something, they said they would fix it, and it looks like they didn't, you know, or you don't have it. So as much as we can put steps in place, offer that, explain what the timeline is, you know, all of those things, meeting donors where they are. Catherine, you had a great analogy in a conversation we had earlier this week about when you take your car into the mechanic, right? Can you share that with the group?
Well, you know, a lot of this stuff is pretty technical, especially like when it comes to, you know, how the co-ops work, modeling scenarios for audience selection, you know, exchanges. Like we shouldn't put the burden on the donor to understand all of this stuff, right? Like I take my car in to get an oil change. Like I trust, you know, the team there to make sure that they do everything that they need to do as part of that process. Like I'm not intimately close to that process, but I trust them with it, right? So, you know, I see, you know, our role is being responsible to the donor and being able to build that trust so that when they come to us and say, I want to come off all of your mailing lists, how do we fulfill upon that?
So you don't need the mechanic to say, well, we hook this hose to this and this thing's leaking, so we're going to do, you know, this 4-syllable term for something, and, you know, which one do you want? You don't need to know everything that's under the hood. You just need to know you're either going to tell me it's all fixed, or you're going to tell me what steps need to happen to, you know, to get to that point. So yeah.
Yeah, and Shannon, if I could I just wanted to add one other thing too, you know, as Catherine was talking, one of our challenges is there are really 4 different territories of Salvation Army. There are like a ton of different websites. The donor doesn't know that, nor do we should expect them to. But when they call and they say, I don't want to be mailed, you know, it gets a little more difficult because now we have to communicate with all the different territories. And if they give to a disaster out in the West and they end up on their database as well, to Catherine's point, they're going to get all that mail again. So it is a lot of responsibility in order to try to manage that as well.
Right,
Yeah,
and
and
regionalized affiliated organizations are, yes.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It's very hard sometimes, and that's has to be part of the conversation, right? We aren't one necessarily. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. We've had a couple of questions pop up in the Q&A, as well as a comment or two in chat about co-ops. We've mentioned that a couple of times, and co-ops are, you know, are different because there's a little bit more of handing over some of that information and losing a little, as organizations, losing sight a bit of some of the ways that those donors are being touched, right? Because they go in, and if they're matching on other people's names and they're part of this bigger group, and so outreach to them is very targeted based on a lot of compiled data together. But it also means that, for example, Catherine, when somebody's calling you and asking for the way their data is being used or the frequency of that, there's a little bit of a blind spot there, you know, for ACS, for the person who's handling that, I think. I mean, anything that any of the three of you want to add on the way that you're talking about co-ops, the way you're either internally or externally with your donors.
Yeah, I mean, the data flow is a two-way street, right? So, if you have a donor that calls up and says, take me off your mailing list, like those suppressions and those values need to filter through, to those other files that are going externally. And making sure the processes are in place to do that. We also put all of the relationships that we have with co-ops through the same rigors of any other, vendor provider that's handling data. So we have a direct relationship with all of those providers, even though we're kind of managing things from an agency partner perspective. Their accountability is ultimately to us.
Okay. So let's talk about some of the differences in the survey about demographics. So ages, there were some interesting differences, breaking points in ages, Cathy, and also donor giving amounts. Donors who gave more had some different answers on some of the questions than donors who gave less. Can you walk us back through, remind us of some of those, and then some of your thoughts on that?
Sure. So I think the fact that large donors are less concerned about using their data for more engaged relationship was a little bit of a surprise to all of us. I think when we looked at that, I think there are reasons for that, but it's why you do surveys, right? Because you want to learn what you don't already know. And I think we were surprised. I'd be curious, Catherine and Karen, on your end, that particular data point, how you think that reflects on your data environment.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in and take that one. I think that, in a way, like once you kind of think it through, it makes sense, because if someone's giving at a higher dollar value, $500 or more, like there's opportunity to use personalization in a way that feels more high touch, more like we know them and understand them better. So that like the higher giving amount would correspond with a kind of a deeper, more personal type relationship.
Yeah, interesting though that they don't find that more Big Brother. It's actually a course of doing business at some level, at some point, right? As opposed to, and then I think the other one was, around using data to streamline communication as well. Even that data point that, people actually want us to manage what they're getting more often, I think, is what I would take away from that. The large number of people said, it's great to use my data so I don't see the same email 3 times, or you don't keep talking to me about the same thing, or I really love dogs, I hate cats. They're okay with that piece. And Karen, I know you have different gender studies with your data and things. What do you think about that particular data point in terms of how you manage your communications?
Yeah, well, we recently converted to a different database, so we're still navigating through it, but the intention is to make sure we identify, or do our best to identify, their preferences so that we can then contact with them about what they prefer. I mean, I think Salvation Army does a lot more than people realize. They deal everything from human trafficking to homelessness to food issues. It just, the list goes on and on. So we get donors that have a lot of different preferences. So we do try to target, and kind of the last subject you guys are talking about, particularly the higher dollar donors, they really want us to focus in. They want to focus in on what's important to them, what drove them to our mission, what are they passionate about. And so that, this personalization helps us. So we're not telling them, if they don't want to hear about something, we're not sending them the same stuff. But on the other hand, there's some of them that really want to hear about things that we didn't even anticipate. So, and it really helps in the mid-level donor program, the major gifts and gift planning. It's just, the information is there. Sometimes there's a lot of information. It ends up being more noise than valuable data. But on our side, we're really working hard to be able to target them better, not to be repetitious, but to maybe modify the message And we've had a lot of this year in particular, for probably all the wrong reasons. It's been a very interesting year because we've been in the media a lot, and we've been able to utilize that that media to emphasize what we really do and really help us and target people more.
And then I think another really interesting database were the differences in autofill. And I'm not quite even sure from a technical perspective what to do with that data point, but interesting that it does bother some people, and some people have, like younger, don't care. They feel in, everything's online. They're doing everything, they expect it, but that's not true across the board. And it'd be interesting to see if there's some tactics around age to sort of play with that and see if it makes a difference, and we have better retention and completion of online donations for older donors if we don't have autofill. I don't know. I think we'll certainly be testing some of that if we can. Not always easy again, but I think it's an interesting data point that I didn't expect it to be so different. So
it is. That's one when we first looked at it, it just was like, okay, let's try to, is it because it feels, is there a sense of creepiness? Like I just got to this form and they already know all my information, versus I think as we implement, all of us are like, oh, this is so much greater. We all know every click, every step, you get attrition. So like, we'll just streamline this whole thing. And in fact, could that be a turnoff for some small slice that maybe isn't even, we don't even register the significance of those bounces from that page. So.
Right. There's a way to check it, which, yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Cathy, can you spend, and I know you've touched on it a couple times, but a little bit more about the split we found in Gen X, because we didn't originally look at we were looking at boomers and we were looking at Gen X, and as we peeled into it, we discovered there were some differences there.
Yeah, there definitely are, which is why we split it, and then I'm just looking at the data around the bartering and selling. It was sort of a little bit different. And I think, some of it is we've tended to lump Gen X together. And the truth is it isn't really one continuum. We have, because of the age of those people, we have very different life stages and experiences within Gen X. We can have people that still have young children and people who children are out of the household and they have disposable income. I think it was an interesting point, Shannon, in that I think we all need to start pulling those data parts apart as we start to look at things, because I'd be curious with you guys, but I think that was my initial feeling, is they're reacting differently because while we call them Gen Xers, they really are in a different place in their life, in a different way of what they do things. Right now they're straddling sort of that, teenage kids or young kids, or the kids are gone and I'm on to my other thing, and where we tend to sort of bundle them all together into a single group. And I think that's one of the reasons we really are seeing differences there. They're not all the same. And, sometimes while demographics are great, we put ourselves in holes sometimes, I think, with demographics, because one, they're easier to use, but two, they don't always hold through all the way through our organizations. And some of us that have done some of those findings find, maybe you need to pull it back a little or turn the lens around a little bit as you're looking at those things. And I think that definitely showed through in the study, which I think was an interesting but unexpected outcome of the survey itself. They aren't the same.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's interesting you say that, Cathy, because we have the issue. I think as human beings, we look at the data and we have expectations of what it's going to show us. So we lead towards that self-fulfilling data conclusion without letting the data speak to us, and making decisions based on how it's talking to us, not the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
So Catharine, how would you, this data, but more so just all the data and all the trends you've been tracking over time, do you have any crystal ball expectations of how donor behavior and attitudes towards data may change as what we're classifying as younger donors today, age into being more of our target, older donor demographics that exist on a lot of organizational charity donor files? Any thoughts on what that's going to look like? And you're entitled to be wrong, because 20 years ago, we all said direct mail was about to die. Everybody would go online, and here we are still talking about both channels. So take a stab.
I am actually really humbled by all of the hands that lift us up. Like if you think of our donors as the many, many hands reaching into their wallets each day to support our mission, like that is, just such a gift. And, like as an organization, and this is not unique to us. I mean, it's just our lot in life in terms of being marketers. The question always is what's the right level of investment, right? And oftentimes that, the amount of revenue generated is what drives some of the decision making. But, at the end of the day, like when you think about the donor experience and about how, yes, like there was that temptation a few years back to say mail is dead. Like the reality is that how people consume media has evolved and changed so dramatically, even in the past 12 months. And, what's great about direct mail is it's tangible. Like, if you're doing it at scale, you can get some really great efficiencies. Someone goes down to the mailbox, and even if they just drop it into the recycling bin, you still get that impression. They're like, oh yeah, the American Cancer Society, I know that. Like, there's something there. And then even if they just take it and put it on their dining room table and come back to it later, that's great. But like once you open it up, I mean, we have controls that have been 25 years plus in the making. So, I mean, it is a well-oiled machine, and, it works. It really works for us in terms of being a reliable source of revenue. Now, the donor experience is an omni-channel experience, and which opens up the door for like so many great conversations around collaboration to what that experience is like, and the kinds of things that we can package up for donors. And even what that looks like as they kind of go through different life stages, through different relationships with the organization, through planned giving, mid-level. I mean, there's a lot of great legs there. So, I think it's tempting to kind of set things like offline channels like direct mail aside, especially if you have organizations that are focused on like digital first. But like direct mail has been digital first for decades in terms of looking at the donor behavior, really trying to optimize based off of that behavior and, generate a solid ROI for the investment and fueling our missions, right? So like in this beautiful work that, the Nonprofit Alliance and the RKD have served up, this information is really great because it reminds us to be really sensitive to kind of how people perceive what they're interacting with beyond just the regular data points that we kind of use to push and pull those leverages from a revenue standpoint, but being really sensitive to like how things are evolving and changing in their world and their perceptions, and even how that clicks to a different experience by age and life stage. I think that that's always valuable feedback and is definitely the breakfast of champions. So thank you.
Thanks, Catherine. Karen, anything to add to that?
The one vision that we have, and this is really a technology issue, we would love to have a donor portal so they can go in and, add their preferences and say, mail me less or not at all, or give us feedback in that way. We're certainly not in Amazon, so we can't, react as quickly and as well as they do, but it's certainly something we would love to be able to do so we could, be better stewards to the donors.
Goes back to that control and choice, and putting them in the driver's seat. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is hard sometimes from a technical perspective to get something that's usable and fast and encompasses every possibility they have to interact with you, right? Easily.
And going back and weighing the risks too, when we go back to that trust factor on, and there was still, to be clear, there was still significant concern about breaches, but it was less with nonprofits than with others. And just so as we're thinking about the more data we collect, the more places we store it, the more touch points we have, the balancing the risk component of that too, and the assurance there. I want to catch up on a couple of questions that are coming in through chat and Q&A. One of them, what's the proper protocol for someone asking to be removed from a database, but still keeping enough information to not have them added back to the file through prospecting? So the actual, the terminology there, remove me or delete my data, which is something that has come up through regulation, but ensuring we have just enough. Cathy, maybe do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so you're allowed to keep enough to suppress them, because what you don't want to do is remail them on acquisition or somewhere else. So when you say remove them, it means take them out of your mail stream, but it doesn't mean you have to get rid of every instance of that, because if you get them on an acquisition list or something like that, you need to be able to suppress them. So you need to make sure they're carefully managed, but you don't have to get rid of so much information that they're going to bring them in through another stream, because it happens in our business all the time. We all see the same names come back that have just gotten suppressed from our list last week, right? So you can keep enough to make sure that you, again, steward that donor the way they've asked, and make sure that you're suppressing them from other sources. So remove is kind of a tricky term. Yeah.
It is, yes. It's the kind of goes back to the mechanic. It's like when you go in and say a certain thing, they have to interpret what you mean by that, and also not change it to the point that the car is no longer safe or no longer going to go in reverse. It's understanding the expectation, meeting that need, and doing the necessary translation. The other piece is keeping enough from an accounting perspective, particularly if the larger donor, you need to be able to go back and
or whatever.
I guess you don't want to lose track of somebody's gift receipting, right? Something like that. So the same donor who says remove me then calls you in a frantic call in March saying I need my gift receipt. So you want to be able to connect those dots for them.
That's true too. Yep.
Yeah. Let me look at a couple other questions here. One of them more of a technical question. If anyone wants to pick this up, do you depersonalize the data before you share it with the co-op? Anyone want to jump in on that one? It's more into the technical specs.
No, when you say personalize before we share it with the co-op, I'm not sure I understand.
So depersonalize it. So you're
depersonalize, like okay,
a D in front of it. Yeah, depersonalize.
No, we don't, because the nature of the co-op, and Cathy's probably a better person to answer that question, because the nature of the co-op is to match up, like if the donor is unique to your organization, they will not share it with anybody else. But if they're not unique, and most donors are not, that's the only way really to match it up. But I'll defer to Cathy. She's probably
right. And some of the modeling that goes along with that in the co-op is, is this a frequent direct mailer? I mean, there are other things behind that, but knowing who they are is part of the value. So understanding why the question about anonymizing is coming up, but the truth is that it takes away the ability to really be able to match that person against the rest of the co-op and understand their activity, and devalues what you can do with the co-op. So.
And then a good point was raised in chat, Karen, around the portal, that you lose the opportunity. We've talked about the great opportunity to have a conversation with a donor when they say that they want to be taken off, having those conversations, and a portal, you lose some of that one-on-one. So again, managing that, or thinking about how you integrate some of that high touch within a self-service functionality. Good point on that. Okay.
Yeah, we all know that even the angry donors are great if they call you, right? That means they're very valuable if they've taken the time. So even the bad ones, right? So.
Absolutely. Well, anything else today that just really jumped out at you from the data, or a place where any of the learnings today, Karen and Catherine, that you feel like you're taking back to your teams, or just processing in the back of your mind that's interesting to you? And Catherine, you're nodding, so I'm going to grab you first. Anything that just jumped out that we haven't covered yet?
I mean, especially after this year, I think the data points specifically around age and giving and the perception, the most humbling and amazing one was the one around trust around data breach. Like, for me, those really jump out. Like, I mean, obviously we see the responsibility that we have to our donors, and, wishing to honor kind of their, needs and communicate in a way that's relevant to them. But, it really is really helpful to see that level of granularity. And that's definitely something I will take back to my team and share with them. And, we will always kind of consider as we kind of think through some of the decisions and changes that we make this year.
Great. Karen, anything for you?
I think for me, it was one of the things that Catherine just mentioned. It is the use of data. And I just want to think about that a little bit more and talk to the major gift and plan giving folks about that, maybe even a mid-level donor, because that one's sort of, I just find interesting. And sometimes the donors will say one thing, but they mean something else. So that's kind of where I take that information.
Yeah,
So,
the interpretation. And as you said, being open to what the data is telling us. We have to really see what's there. So.
Yeah, and then I think something Catherine said earlier is we have to keep, I mean, the world is changing so fast and this year was crazy. I think we have to keep evaluating how our donors feel about our data, which, after this survey, I realized we don't really ask them about the data. We take everything based on response rates and things like that, but I think, the more we can communicate with them and ask them how they feel about how we're talking to them, what we're saying, I think is very valuable.
And the piece that really struck me, and again, it's because at the Nonprofit Alliance, we're spending so much time on the legislative and policy side of this, but what distinguishes nonprofits, what lets us get into a legislator's office and sit down and have a conversation with them is talking about self-regulation and talking about the fact that we do have donor stewardship because we know that our donors can walk out the door. It's not like they're getting they're certainly getting that value from contributing to us, but it's not the same as if they have a bad experience with a retailer or with another company and they value the service so much that they're willing to go back. There's a data breach with a major retailer or a hotel, but it's where they always shop. It's where they always save, and they kind of give some grace on that. Nonprofits may not have that same kind of tolerance sometimes. And so we do take that self-regulation. We do take that meeting donor intent and meeting donors where they are, Catherine, very seriously. That's a responsibility on us. If we start letting that go as the nonprofit sector, if that's no longer something that's distinguishing us from industry as a whole, then we lose our special seat at the table as nonprofits. We lose our ability to go in and look for carve-outs or to be able to say, hey, here's how data is being used for good. Consider this in the legislation that you're crafting or what you're asking businesses that work with nonprofits to take on, right? And so that piece of it, I just don't think we can underscore that enough right now. If we let ourselves blend in and just kind of say, this is how everybody's doing it, or data is moving so fast and we just have to catch up, or this is going to help speed up fundraising and that's so important for us, and we're going to let some of these other things sort of slide or slip it into our privacy policy so we can find a loophole, that's a short-term opportunity, but gosh, long-term, that's so dangerous and so risky to us. And so I some of those data points and certainly the conversation and Catherine and Karen, what you've shared from your organizations really, puts lots of flashing lights and highlights and stars around that. So. Well, we want to do a little bit of a wrap up. Cathy, Karen, Catherine, thank you. First of all, thank you all for having names that start with the same sound. I kept them pretty straight throughout. So I really appreciate you being here with us, sharing so much with us. Cathy, certainly to RKD Group for co-commissioning this study and you walking us through it so clearly today. And we're going to jump ahead to a couple closeout points here. It looks like it's spinning a bit, but I did want to mention a couple events that are coming up at the end of the month. One event at the end of the month on February 23rd, when TNPA, DMFA, and DMAW are co-presenting the legislative update. If you go to the TNPA website and go up to the top and pull down our calendar of events under the events tab, you can register for that webinar. It is free and open to everyone. So come along and get some of those legislative updates. TNPA is also going to be hosting a workshop on stakeholder data. It's a two-part workshop, March 18th and March 25th, that we really get to come together, look at the opportunities, and some of Catherine and Karen have touched on some of those today, but some of the great opportunities with our stakeholders, with warm data that we have already, and how we can make each of us can kind of get past those stumbling blocks and create additional opportunities for our organization. So it looks like our final slide may not be loading, but again, just go to tnpa.org and pull down on our event calendar to find that workshop. And again, thanks so much to each of you. And thanks to everybody for attending today, for the great questions and the participation in chat. We look forward to seeing you again soon.